When you think of Hollywood in the early 1990s, two names stand out in completely different ways. Whitney Houston, already crowned The Voice, had conquered the world with her soaring vocals and unmatched presence on stage. She was more than just a singer, she was a cultural icon whose talent seemed almost untouchable. On the other side stood Kevin Costner, the rugged yet charming leading man, a symbol of American cinema with hits like The Untouchables, Bull Durham, and Field of Dreams. He represented a kind of steady strength, a grounded star whose appeal reached across generations. No one would have predicted that these two stars, from such different worlds, would come together in a way that would forever change both of their lives and careers. That unlikely pairing happened in 1992 with the release of The Bodyguard. Costner not only starred in the film but was instrumental in bringing it to life, and he was convinced that Whitney Houston was the only person who could play Rachel Maror, the glamorous music superstar at the heart of the story. It was a risky decision. Whitney had never acted before, and studios hesitated at the idea of placing a singer in such a demanding leading role. But Kevin was adamant. He saw something in her that went beyond music, something that could transcend the screen. He believed Whitney's vulnerability and power as a performer would bring authenticity to the role. His instinct turned out to be right. The Bodyguard became more than a box office hit, it was a phenomenon. The chemistry between Whitney and Kevin was undeniable. She played the star in need of protection, and he the stoic former Secret Service agent. But what unfolded on screen hinted at something deeper, something that blurred the lines between fiction and reality. The film's soundtrack, led by Whitney's haunting version of I Will Always Love You, became one of the best-selling albums in history. Suddenly, the world wasn't just talking about her voice, they were talking about her presence, her magnetism, and her unexpected partnership with Kevin Costner. But behind the glamour and the global success, questions lingered. What was the real story between Whitney Houston and Kevin Costner? Was their bond simply professional, or was there something unspoken, something more human, that connected them in ways the world could only guess at? Kevin continued to praise Whitney long after the movie wrapped, calling her one of the greatest talents he had ever known. Whitney herself, later in life, would reflect on those years with surprising honesty. Their story is not the cliché of a Hollywood romance, but it is one filled with respect, loyalty, and moments of heartbreak. And it leaves us with a mystery that still fascinates fans decades later. Because at the age of 48, Whitney Houston finally opened up about Kevin Costner, and what she said left the world gasping. Whitney Houston's story began in Newark, New Jersey, on August 9, 1963. She was born into a family where music was more than a passion, it was a legacy. Her mother, Cissy Houston, was a celebrated gospel singer who had performed with Aretha Franklin and Elvis Presley, while her cousins included Dionne Warwick and Dee Dee Warwick. Even her godmother was none other than the Queen of Soul herself, Aretha Franklin. Surrounded by this extraordinary heritage, Whitney's gift seemed destined from the start. As a child, she sang in church choirs, and her powerful voice quickly drew attention. But it wasn't only her voice that captivated people, she carried a natural charisma, a glow that made her stand out. By her teenage years, she was not only performing but also modeling, becoming one of the first black women to grace the cover of 17 magazine. Her beauty and presence were undeniable, but it was her voice that would change everything. At just 19, Whitney was signed to Arista Records under the guidance of legendary producer Clive Davis. In 1985, her debut album, Whitney Houston, took the world by storm, producing hits like Saving All My Love for You, How Will I Know, and Greatest Love of All. She broke records by becoming the first debut artist to generate 3 number-one singles on the Billboard Hot 100. Her follow-up album, Whitney, 1987, solidified her superstardom, making her the first woman in music history to debut at number 1 on the Billboard 200. By the end of the 1980s, Whitney wasn't just a star, she was a global icon, hailed as the voice for her unmatched range and emotional power. Her songs weren't merely pop hits, they were anthems that resonated across cultures and continents. She was elegant, powerful, and seemed almost untouchable. While Whitney was becoming a global sensation, Kevin Costner's path was unfolding on the opposite coast. Born on January 18, 1955, in Linwood, California, and raised in Compton, Kevin was the youngest of 3 boys. His father worked as an electrician and later a utility executive, while his mother was a welfare worker. His upbringing was modest, defined by baseball, fishing trips, and a strong work ethic. Costner attended California State University, Fullerton, where he studied business before gravitating toward acting. Unlike Whitney, whose rise seemed almost predestined, Kevin's journey was slow, filled with uncertainty. He started with small, often forgettable roles, appearing in films that barely registered at the box office. But perseverance paid off. Kevin's breakthrough came with The Untouchables in 1987, where he played federal agent Elliot Ness alongside Hollywood legends like Sean Connery and Robert De Niro. That role established him as a serious actor capable of carrying major films. Soon after, he starred in Bull Durham, 1988, and Field of Dreams, 1989, both of which became cultural touchstones. By the early 1990s, Kevin was at the peak of his career, an actor and director admired not only for his rugged looks but also for the emotional depth he brought to his roles. His Oscar-winning achievement with Dances with Wolves, 1990, which he directed and starred in, proved he was more than a leading man, he was a storyteller with vision. The contrast between Whitney and Kevin couldn't have been sharper. She was the glamorous pop diva, born into music royalty, conquering charts worldwide with a voice that soared above all others. He was the all-American leading man, a symbol of grit and determination, whose success came through persistence and an unwavering belief in his craft. Whitney embodied glamour and vulnerability, Kevin embodied steadiness and resilience. Their worlds seemed light years apart, one glittering with stage lights and Grammys, the other steeped in the tradition of Hollywood storytelling and American cinema. And yet, fate had a way of bringing opposites together. Whitney and Kevin, two figures at the top of their respective worlds, were destined to collide in a project that neither could have predicted would become a cultural phenomenon. The question wasn't if their paths would cross, but when, and when they finally did, the result would create one of the most unforgettable pairings in Hollywood history. When The Bodyguard was first conceived, it wasn't the guaranteed blockbuster that people now remember. In fact, the project had been sitting in development limbo for nearly 2 decades. The script had originally been written in the 1970s and had floated around Hollywood without finding the right team to bring it to life. It wasn't until Kevin Costner, fresh off the extraordinary success of Dances with Wolves and other hits, took a personal interest in the project that it finally gained momentum. Costner believed in the story of a hardened ex-Secret Service agent falling for the glamorous star he was hired to protect. But more than that, he believed the film needed a fresh kind of leading lady, someone who wasn't just another Hollywood actress. That's where Whitney Houston entered the picture. At the time, Whitney was the most celebrated female vocalist in the world. Her albums had topped charts across continents, and her voice was universally recognized as one of the greatest of all time. But acting was new territory. When Costner suggested her for the role of Rachel Maror, there was hesitation from the studio. Could a singer with no acting experience carry a major motion picture opposite one of Hollywood's biggest names? The doubts were understandable, but Costner stood firm. He insisted that Whitney was not only capable but uniquely suited for the part. Her presence, her aura, and her vulnerability as a performer were exactly what the role demanded. Without her, he believed, the film would lack the authenticity it needed. Once Whitney agreed, the reality of her first acting role set in. She admitted in interviews that she felt nervous stepping into such a high-profile project. The pressure was enormous. She wasn't just representing herself, she was representing her career, her fans, and even her community. Kevin, however, became her anchor. On set, he was patient, encouraging, and reassuring, reminding her that the emotions she carried in her music could translate naturally onto the screen. He believed in her completely, and that belief gave Whitney the courage to step into Rachel Maror's shoes with confidence. Their bond on set reflected the very dynamic the film was built on, the seasoned protector guiding the star through moments of vulnerability. The production itself brought unique challenges, but it also created magic. One of the most important creative decisions came with the soundtrack. Originally, the climactic ballad in the film wasn't supposed to be "I Will Always Love You." The plan had been to use a different song, but Costner suggested Whitney try Dolly Parton's classic. He thought the lyrics and the melody would fit perfectly with the story's emotional climax. His instincts proved right once again. Whitney recorded her own version, starting with the now iconic a cappella introduction. The song exploded, becoming a cultural touchstone that still echoes through generations. It spent 14 weeks at #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, broke countless records, and became one of the best-selling singles of all time. As for the movie itself, The Bodyguard exceeded all expectations. Released in 1992, it grossed over $400 million worldwide, making it one of the highest-grossing films of the year. Critics were divided on the storyline, but audiences were captivated. What carried the film wasn't just the suspense or the romance, it was the chemistry between Kevin and Whitney. Their connection on screen felt natural and unforced, blending Kevin's stoic presence with Whitney's emotional intensity. Viewers saw more than just a love story, they saw two worlds colliding in a way that felt believable and moving. For Whitney, the film marked an extraordinary new chapter. Not only did she prove herself as an actress, but she also cemented her place as a cultural icon capable of conquering multiple arenas. For Kevin, it reaffirmed his instincts as a filmmaker and producer who wasn't afraid to take risks. Together, they had turned an uncertain project into a global phenomenon. The soundtrack went on to sell more than 45 million copies worldwide, making it the best-selling movie soundtrack in history. Looking back, it is clear that Kevin's unwavering support of Whitney was the foundation of the film's success. He saw something in her that others didn't, something that went beyond fame or talent. He saw her heart, her authenticity, and her ability to connect with people on a deep emotional level. In believing in her, he not only helped her cross into acting but also created one of the most unforgettable moments in both film and music history. On screen in The Bodyguard, Kevin Costner and Whitney Houston created a dynamic that audiences couldn't look away from. The story of Frank Farmer, the stoic former Secret Service agent, and Rachel Maror, the dazzling yet vulnerable superstar, worked because the two actors brought a natural contrast to their roles. Costner's character was all restraint, discipline, and quiet intensity. Whitney's Rachel was radiant, emotional, and full of fire. The pairing felt electric, not because of exaggerated gestures or forced intimacy, but because both actors leaned into who they already were. Costner projected the calm steadiness of a protector, while Whitney carried the glamour and raw vulnerability of someone living under a spotlight. The result was chemistry that leapt off the screen, making audiences believe in the impossible romance between two people from vastly different worlds. That chemistry, however, immediately sparked rumors. Hollywood and the public alike speculated that their bond had extended beyond the film. Gossip columns at the time asked whether Costner and Houston had fallen for each other in real life. After all, the way they looked at each other in certain scenes, the intensity, the tenderness seemed too genuine to be just acting. But the truth was far more grounded. There is no evidence that the two ever pursued a romantic relationship. Both were, in fact, navigating their own personal lives during and after filming. Whitney was newly married to Bobby Brown when the movie premiered, and Kevin was managing the complexities of his own relationships and family. The supposed romance between them was born of public imagination, fueled by the undeniable spark they created on screen. What did exist, and what has been confirmed time and time again, was a profound friendship rooted in mutual admiration. For Whitney, stepping into acting was an intimidating leap, and Kevin became more than just a co-star, he became a mentor. He reassured her through her nerves, reminded her that her natural presence and emotional honesty would translate into powerful acting. On set, he was patient and protective, not unlike the role he played in the film. That support created a trust between them that was evident both behind and in front of the camera. Kevin, for his part, often spoke with deep respect for Whitney. Long after the cameras stopped rolling, he continued to describe her as one of the greatest singers of our time, a voice that was unmatched and unforgettable. He admired her not only for her talent but also for her courage to step into an unfamiliar world with grace. To him, she wasn't just the singer of iconic ballads, she was a true star, capable of transcending boundaries between music and film. His consistent praise wasn't casual flattery, it reflected a genuine appreciation for who she was as an artist and as a person. Their relationship remained one of authenticity. Unlike many Hollywood partnerships that fade once the cameras are off, theirs held steady through the years. Kevin never distanced himself from Whitney during her more difficult times, nor did he ever shy away from publicly defending her when critics tried to diminish her. For Whitney, his presence during one of the most pivotal moments of her career was unforgettable. She carried with her the gratitude of someone who had been believed in when others doubted her. Audiences may have wanted a romance, but what Whitney and Kevin shared was something deeper in its own way. It was a connection built not on scandal or fleeting attraction, but on respect, loyalty, and admiration. And sometimes, as their story proves, that kind of bond can last longer and mean more than any love affair ever could. Their on-screen chemistry may have been a love story, but off-screen, it was the story of a mentor and a friend who saw each other's true selves and honored that bond for life. After the phenomenal success of The Bodyguard, Whitney Houston entered the 1990s at the absolute height of her career. The movie had made her a credible actress, but it was the soundtrack that catapulted her into a league almost no one else had reached. With I Will Always Love You breaking records around the world, Whitney was no longer just a pop star, she was a global cultural force. Her tours sold out stadiums, her albums topped charts on multiple continents, and she collected awards as though they were inevitable. Grammys, American Music Awards, and countless other honors poured in. She became one of the best-selling artists of all time, her voice recognized across every border, her image plastered on magazine covers worldwide. If the 1980s had established her as a superstar, the years following The Bodyguard cemented her as a legend. In her personal life, however, things were more complicated. Whitney had married Bobby Brown in 1992, the very same year The Bodyguard premiered. Their marriage was instantly under the microscope, partly because it seemed such an unlikely match. Whitney was polished, glamorous, and seen as the epitome of elegance, while Bobby carried a bad boy image from his days in New Edition and his solo career. The press was fascinated with the pairing, and fans speculated endlessly about whether their love could withstand the pressures of fame. For a time, they presented a united front, appearing at events together, raising their daughter Bobby Christina, and even collaborating on music. But behind the smiles and red carpet appearances, turbulence was brewing. Reports of arguments, infidelity, and substance abuse began to surface, feeding the tabloids and slowly chipping away at Whitney's pristine public image. She had been known as America's sweetheart, the voice that could do no wrong, but now stories of her private struggles began overshadowing her professional triumphs. Her battle with drugs became one of the most painful chapters of her life, casting a shadow over the woman the world thought they knew. Fans who had adored her for her angelic voice and grace were now confronted with the human reality of her vulnerabilities. Meanwhile, Kevin Costner continued to flourish in his own career. After The Bodyguard, he maintained his status as one of Hollywood's leading men, starring in films that kept him in the public eye. Yet, no matter how many roles he played or how far his career expanded, his name remained tied to Whitney's through the enduring legacy of their film together. Whenever The Bodyguard was mentioned in interviews or retrospectives, Kevin's praise for Whitney never wavered. He spoke of her talent, her courage in taking on acting, and the magic they created together. In this way, even as Whitney's life became increasingly difficult, she always had in Kevin a loyal defender who reminded the world of her greatness. The contrast between Whitney's public persona and her private struggles was stark. On stage, she remained dazzling, her voice capable of bringing audiences to tears. Even during challenging years, her performances retained a kind of majesty that few artists could match. But off-stage, she was fighting battles that few could fully understand, battles with addiction, with a tumultuous marriage, and with the relentless pressures of fame. For someone whose voice had become a symbol of perfection, the cracks in her personal life felt even more shocking to her fans. It is this duality, superstardom and struggle, that makes Whitney's story so poignant. She was at once larger than life and achingly human, adored by millions yet carrying pain that often went unseen. Kevin Costner, though not present in her day-to-day challenges, remained part of her narrative through the film that had brought them together. His steadfast admiration served as a reminder of the Whitney he saw, the professional, the artist, the woman who dared to take risks and won the world's heart. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, Whitney's career and personal life were marked by highs and lows, but the legacy of The Bodyguard remained untarnished. It was proof of her brilliance at her peak and the undeniable chemistry she shared with Kevin Costner, who never let her memory fade from the respect it deserved. In the years following The Bodyguard, Kevin Costner never missed an opportunity to speak about Whitney Houston with warmth and admiration. For him, the film wasn't just another project on a long resume, it was a defining experience, one tied indelibly to the woman who had trusted him enough to step into the world of acting for the first time. When interviewers asked him about the movie, he consistently steered the conversation toward Whitney's contribution. He called her the real reason the film worked, and stressed that without her voice, her magnetism, and her vulnerability, The Bodyguard would never have become the cultural milestone it did. Kevin's support was especially important because, at the time, critics were divided. Some reviewers questioned whether Whitney, a global singing superstar, belonged on the big screen. There were murmurs that her performance wasn't polished enough, that she was out of her depth compared to seasoned Hollywood actors. But Kevin refused to let those opinions diminish her achievement. In interviews, he pushed back firmly, reminding people that Whitney's performance was raw and authentic precisely because she wasn't trying to be anyone but herself. He believed her ability to bring her real-life experience as a music icon into the role of Rachel Maror gave the film a truth no trained actor could replicate. Again and again, he emphasized that she wasn't just a pop star who happened to be in a movie. She was the heart of The Bodyguard. It was Whitney who carried the emotion, who gave audiences someone to root for, someone they felt they knew. Kevin was proud of his role as Frank Farmer, but he made it clear that the movie's enduring power came from her presence. "People don't just remember me carrying her out of that club," he said in one interview. "They remember her voice, her songs, her beauty, her vulnerability. That's what made the movie unforgettable." These words weren't offered as passing compliments, they were seeds of respect that grew deeper as time went on. Long after the premiere, long after the soundtrack broke every conceivable record, Kevin still spoke about Whitney in the present tense, as though her impact hadn't faded. When asked about the film decades later, he described her as a miracle of talent and said that he was proud to have been part of the moment that introduced her to acting. He reminded audiences that Whitney had taken a risk by stepping into an unfamiliar medium and had succeeded in a way few others could. This loyalty became even more poignant as Whitney faced struggles in her personal life. While tabloids ran sensational headlines about her marriage and addiction, Kevin never joined the chorus of critics. Instead, he chose to remember her at her best, the woman who had stood beside him on set, nervous but radiant, and delivered a performance that would live forever. In a business where alliances often vanish once the cameras stop rolling, Kevin's unwavering admiration set him apart. By continuing to speak highly of Whitney year after year, Kevin did more than defend her legacy, he preserved it. He made sure people remembered the artist who captivated the world in The Bodyguard, not just the troubled figure portrayed in gossip columns. And in doing so, he gave fans a glimpse of the profound respect he carried for her, a respect that would only become more evident in the years to come. By the time Whitney Houston reached her late 40s, the arc of her life and career had taken her through some of the highest peaks and most difficult valleys imaginable. After years of tabloid scrutiny and personal struggles, she sought to reclaim her place in the music world with her 2009 album I Look to You. The project was presented as a comeback, and for Whitney, then 46, it was both a professional and personal statement. The songs spoke of resilience, faith, and endurance, and in promoting the album she gave a series of interviews that reminded fans why they had fallen in love with her in the first place. Her voice, though weathered by time and hardship, still carried the unmistakable power of her gift. And her words, often candid and reflective, offered glimpses into the woman behind the icon. At 48, in the final years of her life, Whitney spoke more openly about her past than ever before, including her time on The Bodyguard. Looking back nearly 2 decades after its release, she recalled not only the global success of the film and soundtrack but also the personal journey it represented. Acting had been an intimidating challenge, one that she might have refused if not for Kevin Costner's unwavering belief in her. In interviews, she admitted that she had been nervous, even scared, about stepping onto a movie set with no prior acting experience. The weight of expectation was enormous. But she remembered how Kevin had stood by her side, reassuring her that she had everything it took to succeed. What Whitney revealed during these reflections was more than nostalgia, it was gratitude. She credited Kevin with giving her the confidence to cross into film at a time when she doubted herself. She described him not just as a co-star but as a protector and mentor who made her feel safe in a world she did not know. It wasn't the kind of dramatic confession tabloids might have hoped for. There was no romance, no scandal. Instead, it was something far more meaningful, an acknowledgement of respect and loyalty, of the courage that someone else's faith can instill in you when you need it most. Her candid reflections about Kevin showed the depth of their connection. She recalled how patient he was with her, how he never once made her feel small for being inexperienced. She remembered how he guided her gently, never trying to overshadow her but instead helping her shine. For Whitney, who had always been in control of her domain on stage, the vulnerability of being on a film set was daunting. But Kevin's support allowed her to bring her authentic self to the role of Rachel Maror. "He believed in me," she once said, summing up the essence of what their collaboration meant to her. Fans who heard Whitney speak this way in her late 40s were moved because it was so rare for her to open up about Kevin in such personal terms. She was a woman who had endured public heartbreak, professional criticism, and private battles, and yet when she looked back at The Bodyguard, her words carried no bitterness, only appreciation. At 48, she wanted the world to know that Kevin Costner had been more than just a Hollywood colleague. He had been a friend at a critical moment, someone who saw her not just as a pop star but as an artist capable of so much more. This openness tied directly to the emotional pull of her story. It wasn't about secrets of romance or hidden affairs. It was about truth, the truth that behind one of the most successful films of all time was a friendship and trust that allowed Whitney to take a leap she might never have taken otherwise. For a woman whose later years were so often clouded by pain and misunderstanding, these reflections cut through the noise. They showed the grace and gratitude of someone who, even in the twilight of her career, still remembered and cherished the people who had helped her become who she was. In those words, Whitney gave fans one of her final gifts. She opened a window into her heart and confirmed what many had always suspected: her bond with Kevin Costner was one of respect, admiration, and enduring gratitude. At 48, she finally put it into words, and what she revealed left the world gasping, not because it was scandalous, but because it was so deeply human. When Whitney Houston passed away on February 11, 2012, at the age of 48, the world was stunned. News of her death spread instantly, leaving fans, friends, and colleagues reeling with grief. The voice that had defined a generation was suddenly gone, and though many knew of her struggles in the years leading up to her passing, the finality of it was almost too much to bear. Across the globe, tributes poured in not only from the music industry but from film, television, and beyond. For millions of people, Whitney wasn't just a singer, she was a cultural icon who had given them songs of love, heartbreak, and hope. Among those who felt the loss most deeply was Kevin Costner. Nearly 20 years had passed since The Bodyguard, but his connection to Whitney was something he had never stopped honoring. So when it came time to say goodbye, it was only fitting that Kevin would play a central role at her funeral. On February 18, 2012, at New Hope Baptist Church in Newark, New Jersey, the very church where Whitney had sung as a girl, he stood before her family, friends, and an audience watching around the world to deliver one of the most heartfelt eulogies of his life. Kevin's words were not those of a detached Hollywood co-star. They came from a man who had witnessed Whitney's vulnerabilities, who had guided her through her first steps into acting, and who had carried her legacy with pride for 2 decades. He began by recalling the Whitney he first knew, not the superstar, but the young woman filled with nerves as she prepared to take on her first film role. He remembered how she doubted herself, how she wanted everything to be perfect, and how she sometimes struggled with the pressure of living up to expectations. Yet, he reminded everyone, beneath the uncertainty was a woman of extraordinary strength and an almost otherworldly gift. Throughout his eulogy, Kevin's protective instincts were evident. He spoke as though he was still shielding Whitney from criticism, even in death. He urged the world to remember her not for her troubles, but for her triumphs. Whitney was a sweet miracle, he said, his voice heavy with emotion. He described her as someone whose beauty, talent, and spirit combined to create a presence unlike anyone else. Kevin wanted people to see her the way he had seen her, not through the lens of tabloid headlines, but through the eyes of a friend who knew her worth. He reminded the mourners of the magic they had created together in The Bodyguard, and how much of that magic came from Whitney herself. He called attention to her voice, her courage, and her ability to touch hearts in ways that transcended fame. He admitted that she wasn't always confident, that she had fears like anyone else, but that those qualities only made her more human, more relatable, and more beloved. For those watching, Kevin's words were unforgettable. They painted a picture of Whitney not as a fallen star, but as a woman who had been, in his eyes, a miracle. The eulogy resonated because it wasn't just about mourning, it was about protecting her legacy. Kevin seemed determined to make sure that people left the church remembering the Whitney who had dazzled the world, not the Whitney who had struggled in private. As he stepped away from the pulpit that day, it was clear that Kevin's tribute had struck a chord. The cameras captured the tears of family members, fellow performers, and fans around the world. His words had cut through the grief and offered something healing, a reminder that Whitney's story was one of greatness, not just tragedy. That final goodbye underscored the bond they had shared. Kevin Costner had been there at the beginning of her acting career, encouraging her to believe in herself when she was unsure. And in the end, he was there again, speaking up for her when she could no longer speak for herself. In life and in death, his role in Whitney Houston's story was the same: to stand by her, to honor her, and to remind the world of the miracle she truly was. The story of Whitney Houston and Kevin Costner endures because it was never built on gossip or scandal, but on something far more powerful: respect, loyalty, and truth. When people look back at The Bodyguard, they don't just remember the record-breaking soundtrack or the famous poster of Kevin carrying Whitney in his arms. They remember the chemistry between the two stars, the trust that shone through in every scene, and the way that trust translated into real life. For Whitney, Kevin was more than a co-star, he was someone who believed in her when she doubted herself. And for Kevin, Whitney was more than a singer trying her hand at acting, she was the heart of a film that became a phenomenon. This balance of mutual admiration created a bond that, while never romantic, was deeply meaningful. It is this bond that fans continue to celebrate years after Whitney's passing. Kevin has never stopped speaking about Whitney. Long after the lights dimmed on The Bodyguard, he continued to honor her in interviews, reminding audiences of her bravery in taking on an acting role and the authenticity she brought to it. Even years after her death, his words still carry the same weight of admiration. He recalls the nervous young woman on set, the one who doubted herself, and insists that her vulnerability was part of her greatness. In his eyes, Whitney was not defined by her struggles but by the miracle of her voice, her beauty, and her humanity. This loyalty has shaped the way the public remembers them. Fans see Kevin as someone who stood by Whitney at a time when she needed reassurance, and later, as someone who defended her legacy when she was no longer here to defend it herself. His eulogy at her funeral became a touchstone, not only because of the emotion in his words, but because they confirmed what many had sensed: his respect for Whitney was sincere and enduring. What makes their story so iconic is its authenticity. In a world where Hollywood relationships are often scrutinized and sensationalized, Whitney and Kevin's connection was refreshingly genuine. There were no rumors of scandal that defined them, no bitter feuds or falling outs. Instead, what remained was a portrait of two artists who shared an extraordinary moment in history and carried that memory with dignity. Fans continue to revisit The Bodyguard not just for its romance on screen but for the knowledge of what existed behind the camera, a bond built on encouragement, trust, and mutual admiration. For many, this makes the film even more poignant. They see in it not just a fictional love story, but a reflection of real human connection, a reminder that respect can be just as moving, and just as lasting, as romance. Over a decade after Whitney's passing, the legacy of her partnership with Kevin Costner still resonates. Every time Kevin speaks about her, whether in interviews or tributes, he keeps her memory alive in a way that transcends celebrity. He frames her story not in terms of tragedy, but in terms of triumph: her voice, her courage, her willingness to take risks. And in doing so, he ensures that Whitney is remembered for the miracle she truly was. The legacy of their bond is, ultimately, a testament to the power of authenticity. Whitney and Kevin gave the world a story that continues to inspire because it is rooted not in illusion, but in truth. It shows that sometimes the most lasting connections are not romantic at all, they are the ones built on loyalty, respect, and an unshakable belief in each other's greatness. And that is why, decades later, the world still gasps when reminded of what Whitney Houston once said about Kevin Costner, that he gave her courage, that he believed in her, and that his faith made all the difference. In the end, the truth behind Whitney Houston's words about Kevin Costner at 48 wasn't scandal, nor was it some hidden romance waiting to be exposed. It was something much deeper, and perhaps far more moving: gratitude, admiration, and an acknowledgement of the bond that had carried her through one of the most important chapters of her career. For Whitney, Kevin had been the steady presence who believed in her when she questioned herself, who guided her through the uncertainties of her acting debut, and who never let her forget the power she carried within. When she finally spoke openly about him in her later years, what she revealed was a profound respect for the man who had helped her take that leap of faith. Kevin's loyalty to Whitney proved that their connection was timeless. Long after The Bodyguard left theaters, long after the soundtrack shattered every record, he continued to speak of her with a reverence that never wavered. And when the world lost her in 2012, it was Kevin who stepped forward to remind everyone that Whitney Houston was not defined by her struggles, but by her miraculous gift and her humanity. His words at her funeral echoed the same truth she herself had once shared, that their story was one of encouragement, trust, and unshakable respect. Perhaps that is why their story still resonates so strongly. In a world where celebrity narratives are often dominated by gossip, Whitney and Kevin gave us something rare: authenticity. Their bond wasn't about headlines, it was about faith in one another, about lifting each other up in moments of doubt. That authenticity is what makes their connection endure, even years after Whitney's passing. Fans don't look back at them with curiosity for secrets, they look back with awe at the purity of a friendship that carried both of them beyond the lights of Hollywood. And maybe that's the final lesson. The real love story of The Bodyguard wasn't the scripted romance of Frank Farmer and Rachel Maror, it was the friendship that lasted off-screen, through triumphs and heartbreaks, through applause and silence. It was the courage Kevin gave Whitney, and the gratitude she gave back to him. That bond, grounded in truth, remains unshaken by time. Even now, when Whitney's voice fills the air with "I Will Always Love You," and when we remember Kevin's tears as he said goodbye, the world still gasps, not from shock, but from the depth of a story that was always more than a movie. It was real, it was human, and it will never be forgotten.